In the summer of 1950, the world stood on the edge of a new era. Just 5 years after the end of World War II, another devastating conflict erupted. Yet, unlike the global wars that came before it, this conflict would slowly fade from public memory. Today, many people know little about it. Historians often call it the Forgotten War. This is the story of the Korean War, a brutal struggle that shaped modern Asia and changed the course of the Cold War forever. To understand how the war began, we must travel back to the end of World War II in 1945. For decades, Korea had been under Japanese rule. When Japan surrendered, Korea was suddenly liberated. But freedom came with a problem. The Soviet Union occupied the northern half of the peninsula, while the United States occupied the south. What was supposed to be a temporary division along the 38th parallel quickly became permanent. Two separate governments emerged. In the north, a communist state backed by the Soviet Union. In the south, an anti-communist government supported by the United States. As tensions between East and West intensified, Korea became one of the first battlegrounds of the Cold War. On June 25, 1950, the fragile peace shattered. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and launched a massive invasion of South Korea. Equipped with Soviet tanks and weapons, they advanced rapidly. South Korean forces were overwhelmed. Within days, the capital city of Seoul fell. The world watched as the North appeared unstoppable. For many leaders in Washington, this invasion was more than a regional conflict. It was seen as a test of whether communism would continue expanding across the globe. The United Nations responded with unusual speed. Under a UN resolution, an international force led primarily by the United States was sent to defend South Korea. American troops arrived quickly, but they faced a difficult reality. North Korean forces continued pushing southward, capturing vast territory. By August 1950, South Korean and UN troops were confined to a small defensive area around the city of Busan. It seemed as if South Korea might disappear entirely. Then came one of the most daring military operations of the 20th century. In September 1950, General Douglas MacArthur launched an amphibious landing at Incheon, far behind enemy lines. The operation caught North Korean forces completely off guard. UN troops rapidly advanced inland, recaptured Seoul, and forced the North Korean army into retreat. What had looked like a certain defeat suddenly transformed into a dramatic victory. Encouraged by this success, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel and pushed deep into North Korea. Their goal shifted from defending South Korea to reunifying the peninsula under a single government. As troops advanced toward the Chinese border, many believed the war was nearly over, but a new and powerful player was about to enter the conflict. In late 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers crossed into North Korea. China viewed the advancing UN forces as a direct threat to its security. The surprise intervention changed everything. Massive Chinese offensives drove UN forces southward. Seoul changed hands once again. Soldiers on both sides faced freezing temperatures, brutal combat, and unimaginable hardships. In some areas, winter conditions became almost as deadly as enemy fire. As the war continued, neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Front lines moved back and forth before eventually stabilizing near the original border. What followed was a bloody stalemate. Battles were fought over hills, ridges, and strategic positions that often held little value beyond a few hundred yards of ground. Yet thousands of soldiers died trying to capture or defend them. Meanwhile, the conflict created a devastating humanitarian crisis. Families were separated forever. Cities were destroyed. Millions of civilians were displaced from their homes. Entire communities vanished in the chaos of war. For ordinary Koreans, survival became the daily struggle. The human cost was staggering. By the end of the war, millions of soldiers and civilians had been killed, wounded, or displaced. Back in the United States, public support for the war began to decline. Unlike World War II, there were no dramatic victories leading toward unconditional surrender. Instead, Americans saw a costly conflict with no clear end in sight. Political disagreements emerged over strategy, leadership, and the risk of expanding the war into a larger confrontation with China or even the Soviet Union. The Korean War became a symbol of the challenges and uncertainties of the Cold War era. After 2 years of difficult negotiations, an armistice agreement was finally signed on July 27, 1953. The fighting stopped, but no formal peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North Korea and South Korea remain at war to this day. A heavily fortified demilitarized zone, known as the DMZ, was established near the 38th parallel. It remains one of the most heavily guarded borders in the world. The legacy of the Korean War is still visible today. South Korea eventually transformed into one of the world's leading economies and democracies. North Korea became one of the most isolated and heavily militarized nations on Earth. The division created by the war continues to shape international politics, regional security, and the lives of millions of Koreans. So why is it called the Forgotten War? Perhaps because it occurred between the triumph of World War II and the controversies of the Vietnam War. Perhaps because it ended not with victory, but with a ceasefire. Yet despite being overlooked, the Korean War changed the world in profound ways. It defined the early Cold War, demonstrated the dangers of ideological conflict, and left a legacy that continues more than 70 years later. The Korean War may be forgotten by some, but its consequences are impossible to ignore. Along the divided Korean peninsula, the echoes of that conflict can still be heard today. And as long as the border remains, the story of the Forgotten War remains unfinished. End.